In my column in the Daily News today, I zeroed in particularly on one of the big arguments that's been raised about these testing programs and these school reforms, that they were going to close the achievement gap between Black and Latino kids on the one hand and white children on the other. And here in New York City, Mayor Bloomberg and Chancellor Klein have been claiming for years that they've been closing the gap. Now, all of a sudden, these new test scores are revealing that the gap has actually increased since 2003, when Mayor Bloomberg began his school reforms here in New York. Your sense of how the impact of these particular scores here in New York State and New York City and what it means for the rest of the country?
Well, I hope it provides another example about why test-based accountability as the primary method for school improvement just does not work. When you put all this pressure on testing without giving students the tools and the teachers the tools to learn more, all you do is put pressure on schools and elected officials to game the system. And so for over, the last 5 years or so, we've all known that the state tests have gotten far easier and that the scoring has gotten far easier and that you could actually just randomly answer questions and pass. And, we've been making that clear, and yet there hasn't been any political will to do about it until now, because the state officials and the city officials and the principals and the parents all want to believe that our schools are getting better, even in the face of tremendous evidence that they aren't. So the same sort of policies, as Diane says, that have been predominant in New York City for the past 8 years are the same sort of policies that Obama wants to now impose nationwide. They simply do not work, and they lead to very devastating impacts, especially on our highest need students, who tend to be in the schools that are going to be closed, transformed, or turned into charter schools. One of the schools there are over 1,000 schools on the list nationwide that they want to either close or fire half the teaching staff or turn over to a charter school is the Hawaiian School for the Blind and the Deaf. Where are those kids going to go? If you fire half their teaching staff, where are they going to be able to recruit trained people in terms of being able to reach deaf and blind children? It simply doesn't make any sense. We need a whole new set of policies that are actually going to improve the quality of instruction in the classroom, like, for example, smaller classes.
Diane Ravitch, you were Assistant Secretary of Education under President George H.W. Bush. You were a supporter of charter schools. Now you are not supporting them. How does this picture feed into President Obama's plan?
Well, President Obama has proceeded with the belief that charter schools are some kind of a miracle cure. And in fact, Secretary Duncan says, well, we recognize that there are some bad charter schools, but we're only going to encourage good charter schools. Well, that's sheer nonsense, because what we will see in the next few years under Race to the Top is hundreds, if not thousands, of new charter schools. And the research is very clear that the overwhelming majority of charter schools are not excellent charter schools. And the interesting thing that happened with this score collapse in New York City was that the charters saw a bigger decline in their test scores than the regular public schools. And now in reading, charters don't outperform public schools at all. They're at exactly the same point, and they barely outperform them in math. So what we're going to see is, under his plan, is a massive privatization, particularly in the inner city. These are communities of color that have been targeted for the charter school invasions, where public schools will be converted to charters, where public schools will be closed in large numbers and replaced by privately managed schools. Some of them will be opened by greedy entrepreneurs. Some of them will be opened by incompetent people. And this is not educational improvement. It's really tragic, because the Secretary and the President are using Chicago as their template, and yet no one looks at Chicago and asks, is Chicago a successful city? And the answer is no. If you talk to anybody who lives in Chicago who doesn't work for Mayor Daley, Chicago is not an example of school reform. It's an example where communities of color experience all the things that I've just been describing: school closings, indifference to parent views about anything, and opening lots of new schools, opening lots of charter schools, massive infusion of money from the Gates Foundation, and yet Chicago remains today one of our lowest performing urban districts, and that, unfortunately, is the model for the nation.
And Leonie, what's going to happen now here in New York State? All these parents that have been told that their children were doing well, were meeting state expectations, and now suddenly will discover in the next few weeks that their kids are in need of help, that their scores were not what they were before. What's going to happen in terms of the kind of remediation that New York City and New York State are going to have to now do for students that they weren't recognizing before?
Well, I think parents are rightfully going to be devastated when they find out that the whole thing was a fraud and that their children are not doing well and not succeeding and not learning. Unfortunately, I don't see any evidence either on the state level or the city level that they're prepared to give any more help to these kids to really make sure that they succeed. Our budgets are being cut back radically. Class sizes are going to go up hugely in the fall. A lot of the support systems, the after-school programs, the tutoring, the interventions programs are being cut. So it's going to get worse, not better. And the only policy that this administration has in order to supposedly help these kids is holding them back. And the overwhelming research shows that holding back kids does not help. It hurts. And it leads to higher dropout rates in the end. So we have no culture of helping to support schools in this city. And it looks like across the nation, we again have no culture and no expectation that the Obama administration really wants to help our schools improve. They just want to shut them down, fire the teachers, privatize them, and impose other sort of test-based accountability reforms that simply don't work.
And Lainey Hampson, can you talk back in Chicago about the new leadership of the Chicago Teachers Union, CORE, the caucus of rank-and-file educators, and the significance of their victory?
Well, in Chicago, as Diane mentioned, they've been experiencing these sorts of policies longer than anywhere else in the country. Under Mayor Daley, who has total mayoral control and is sort of mayor for life, it's been over 12.
Arnie Duncan.
And Arnie Duncan, who was the head of the Chicago schools for a long period of time. Those teachers have seen the failure of these policies, have seen their schools destabilized, have seen no progress, have seen teachers scapegoated as the source of all problems in the schools, which is, of course, ridiculous. And so a new faction in the teachers union has taken control and won the election, which has a much more aggressive posture towards these reforms, and at every single moment is protesting, is pushing, and not taking any of this for granted and saying, no, this does not work. There's a better way, and you have to listen to not just teachers, but parents who are also extremely disaffected in Chicago and who have shown up in huge protests to the closing of their neighborhood schools because they don't see that they're being offered a better option.
We're going to leave it there for today, but of course continue to cover this issue. Lainey Hampson is with us, public school parent and executive director of Class Size Matters. And thank you to Diane Ravitch, professor of education at NYU, senior fellow at Brookings Institution, former assistant secretary of education under President George H.W. Bush. Her book is called The Death and Life of the Great American School System. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Arizona to the anti-immigrant law protests that have been taking place.